nuclear family is the traditional human family is really quite a problematic one. The human family is not, or rather the ideal situation for humans to raise children in is not the nuclear family, where husbands and wives are expected to raise their children with no help from elsewhere. In fact, reproduction requires a lot of cooperation. Women need a lot of support to raise their children, and worldwide we know that women do get a lot of support for reproduction, although where this support comes from is quite variable. In lower middle-income countries, there's a lot of family support for child rearing from grandparents, from older siblings of children, other family members. In high-income countries, the situation is quite different in that we rely a lot on formal schooling, formal childcare, sometimes nannies and so on, although grandparents too are still very important sources of childcare. So the impetus for my talk really comes from the idea from evolutionary anthropology that humans are cooperative breeders. So this is a term in biology meaning that females need to get a lot of help in raising their children. They cannot raise children alone. It's actually quite a rare strategy across other species, but about 10% of birds do it, for example. Oh, I should say on that slide, Sarah Haddy is the evolutionary anthropologist who has been most strongly associated with this particular idea. She's written an excellent book called Mothers and Others, which talks through the history of cooperative breeding in our species, and it's an excellent popular book if you have time hands at the moment. So the research I'm going to be talking about is the work that I've done testing the hypothesis that cooperation is really fundamental to human reproduction. So the questions I've been asking are, is there evidence that the presence of family members beyond the nuclear family influences fertility? And I've also looked for evidence that these relationships are driven by cooperative behaviour, by helping within the family, which is what the cooperative breeding hypothesis suggests. I'm also interested in how these patterns vary cross-culturally. As I've just said, women use support from quite different sources in different populations. So I'm interested in exploring how these issues vary between different societies. The first thing I did as part of this research project is to do a literature review of all of the published studies which have statistically correlated some measure of family availability with some measure of fertility. Kin availability is often measured quite crudely in most studies simply because of data availability. It's often measured as either whether kin is still alive in a population or whether they're co-resident with mothers and couples. Fertility is actually quite a complicated issue to study as the outcome variable. There are many different ways of measuring it, and the kinds of fertility measures in this literature review included age at first birth, length of birth intervals, total number of births, as well as a few other measures such as fertility intentions, although most of the studies were either age at first birth, birth intervals, or total fertility. This is a very brief overview of some of the characteristics of the data set. So in terms of the location of these studies that were in this literature review, they're really from all over the world. They're from Asia, North America, Europe, fewer in Africa, but still a reasonable number in Africa. Most of them are from contemporary populations, but we did look for all literature on this topic, so some of these data points also include historical data sets. The fertility rate in the populations that were studied is quite variable, but it's roughly evenly split between those we've considered high, which is 3 or more children, or low, which is under 3. So jumping straight onto the results, what this slide shows is the proportion of all studies which found a positive association between each of the different relatives on the screen and women's fertility. By positive, I mean if that kin was available, then the woman had higher fertility. I'm just going to focus for the purposes of this talk on parents and parents-in-law, so relationships between the availability of the woman's parents or her parents-in-law and her own fertility. What you can see is that there seems to be a relatively consistent, though not universal, positive association between the availability of a woman's parents-in-law and her fertility. Essentially, if her in-laws are around, the woman has higher fertility. The relationship is a bit different if you look at her own parents. The data set was about evenly split between those where there was a positive or a negative association between the availability of parents and the woman's fertility. I should say here that this graph shows the direction of the effects in the study, regardless of statistical significance, But in fact, the substantive conclusions of the review are the same if you just look at the significant, those studies which found a significant association between fertility and women's kin. So that even split between positive and negative associations for women's parents is actually what you'd expect if there were no relationship at all between the availability of parents and a woman's fertility, because just randomly you'd expect half associations to be negative and half to be positive. So at least if you look at all measures of fertility, which is what this graph is showing, we see some evidence that in-laws are positively associated with fertility. Evidence is not so clear-cut for parents. I should say the numbers in brackets are the numbers of studies that go into each bar. So there are quite a reasonable numbers of studies on this. So that slide showed all of the fertility measures put in together in that graph. The picture actually looks a little bit different if you break the analysis down by different fertility measure. So what you're seeing on the screen right now are the same graph, but broken down by fertility outcome. So the top graph only looks at age at first birth, associations between women's kin and age at first birth. The middle one is length of intervals, and the last one is total number of live births. And you see different pictures if you look at different measures of fertility. If you look at length of interbirth intervals, for example, there's actually quite consistent evidence that the availability of either parents or parents-in-law are positively associated with fertility. What this means here is that if those kin are available, then the woman has shorter birth intervals, which all else equal will mean higher fertility. That again isn't universal, however, it's quite consistent at around 80% of studies for both parents and parents-in-law. Things look really quite different if you look at age at first birth. In that case, the association between in-laws and fertility, again, is positive, but between parents and fertility, it's actually more likely to be negative. In only about a third of studies was there a positive association between having kin around and having an earlier first birth. I'm actually not going to say any more about that association between age at first birth. I think it's a very interesting issue, but I don't have time to talk about it in this talk. What I'm going to focus now on is the positive associations between both parents and parents-in-law and shorter interbirth intervals, because this is indication that where women are getting help from their parents or parents-in-law, they are able to speed up their reproductive rate and ultimately have more children. So that's just a quick summary of what I've just said. What I'm now going to go on to do is to talk about whether those positive associations are actually driven by cooperative behaviour, by helping between kin. So I said a lot of the studies in that literature review were quite crude in terms of they just looked at kin availability in terms of the presence of the kin. Most studies don't have detailed data on actual helping behaviour between women and her parents or parents-in-law. So it's not necessarily the case that those positive associations are actually driven by helping between kins. There could be all kinds of other explanations for those positive associations. However, we also know from other evidence that kin do help women with child rearing. We know that they help directly with childcare. We know they help with financial support, with domestic work, with agricultural labour or other economic productivity. So we know from other evidence that there is certainly helping behaviour between kin. Can we put those two pieces of evidence together and show that cooperative behaviour within families actually does increase women's fertility? So the next thing we did was to do studies in two different populations, a middle-income country, Indonesia, using the Indonesian Family Life Survey, and in the UK, a high-income, low-fertility country. Kristen Stopkowski was the postdoc who did the research in Indonesia. Susie Schaffnett worked in the UK. Both data sets do have detailed data on actual helping behaviour between kin, as well as kin availability and fertility outcomes as well. So the Indonesian Family Life Survey is a longitudinal survey. It's important to emphasise as well that both studies are longitudinal, so we can look at whether helping behaviour between kin at one point in time is subsequently associated with fertility, which also strengthens the argument that there is a causal relationship between the two. And what we did with the Indonesian study was to do a path analysis, a causal pathway analysis, trying to look for statistical evidence that the hypothesized causal pathway, that is, that the positive relationship between kin availability, measured here by geographic proximity, and having another birth, is mediated through kin contacting one another, because if kin aren't contacting one another, then they can't be helping one another very much. And also whether women are actually receiving physical help from their parents or parents-in-law. Physical help was measured in a number of ways, including childcare and help around the home, for example. And to cut a long story short, the pathway analysis is at the bottom of the screen, and we did find evidence that the relationship between kin availability and fertility was mediated through the actual provision of help. This is still a statistical correlational analysis, so again, we can't prove causality. However, it does show that the hypothesized helping relationship between kin and fertility is at least plausible in this particular population. So that's Indonesia. In the UK, Susie used the Millennium Cohort Study, which is a birth cohort study of children born around the year 2000, to look at whether help provided to the child in the study's mother was associated with her going on to have a second birth. The data we have in the UK is a little bit more complicated, and it's not just about family support. So in high-income countries, women tend to receive support from many different sources, not just their own family, but also formal support, childcare, and so on. This is quite small on the screen, I think, but what this graph is showing is where women are getting support from. So there isn't any fertility on this particular screen. We're looking here at where women are getting support from. And we have broken down this analysis in the UK by socioeconomic position. The UK is a very large stratified population. We know there are differences between socioeconomic strata in things like where women are, who women live near, for example, and also fertility patterns. So this UK analysis, we looked quite carefully at whether the patterns we were observing differed between different socioeconomic groups. The other thing you have on the slide here is the provision of support for women who were partnered and who are not partnered. In high-income populations like the UK, there is really a cultural emphasis on the nuclear family. So women do get quite a lot of support from their husbands for child rearing, perhaps rather more so than other family members to some extent. So we also break this analysis down by whether women were partnered or not, because women who are not partnered are likely to be getting firstly more support from elsewhere, but they may also be getting it from different sources. And what you see, what the results of this graph show, is that women in different socioeconomic groups and who are partnered or unpartnered are getting support, but they're getting it from slightly different sources. So if you look top left, women who are of lower socioeconomic position, particularly who are unpartnered, are getting quite a lot of childcare from their parents. This is less true for other groups of women. Women in higher socioeconomic positions tend to be more likely to be getting paid childcare, for example, if you look at the middle graph on the right-hand side. So we do see that there are differences in where women are getting support from. Women, for example, who don't have support from partners tend to be substituting in support from elsewhere. This can be particularly clearly seen on the graph on the top right, where unpartnered women across all socioeconomic groups are getting much more financial support from their parents than are partnered women. So the picture of support in high-income countries like the UK is quite complicated, but nevertheless, women are getting quite a lot of support after they've had a child. Is this support correlated with fertility was ultimately the question we were interested in. And the picture again is a bit more complicated than it was in Indonesia. The answer, roughly speaking, is yes, but there were some differences between socioeconomic groups. There were also differences between different types of support. So in the UK, we also had information on the kinds of support that women were getting from various different sources. For example, we knew whether or not they were getting financial support from their parents or parents-in-law. We knew if they were getting childcare from different sources. And we also had information on emotional support. So emotional support was support from, again, not necessarily from kin, but support from friends, having friends to talk to, having that emotional support network around you. And what we found is that receiving emotional support in the UK was associated with a higher probability of having a second child. What we didn't expect, but what we also found, was that receiving financial support from parents was associated with a lower probability of having a second birth. So that wasn't what we expected, but we think what may be driving that is that Women who are receiving financial support from their parents or parents-in-law are not in a very good financial situation to have another child. So receiving financial support may be an indication that women are not in a very good economic position, which makes them less likely to have another child. So financial support is actually negatively correlated with fertility, emotional support positively correlated with fertility. We also looked at childcare. So this is direct childcare support from families particularly. Here we found differences between different socioeconomic groups. So women in the highest tercile of socioeconomic position did not see that. Actually, let me talk about it the other way around. Women in the lowest tercile of socioeconomic position had a higher probability of second birth if they were receiving childcare from families. So this again is evidence that receiving support for childcare is positively associated with fertility, but we only saw this in the lowest tercile of socioeconomic position. In fact, there even seemed to be an opposite relationship for women in the highest tercile. So women who got childcare from their families seem to have a lower probability of second birth. However, there were actually very few women getting childcare from families in the highest socioeconomic position group, so we don't put very much weight on that particular finding. Childcare from families was much more common in the other socioeconomic groups, where it did seem to be positively correlated with fertility. So the picture in the UK seems quite complicated. There's some evidence that support is increasing fertility, but there may be some differences between different socioeconomic groups. And it also seems like financial support isn't increasing women's fertility. So just let me end talking briefly about implications for future fertility. So Thomas has already mentioned this. He only mentioned support briefly in passing, but I think the issue of support really is key in terms of implications for future fertility. It's also, in fact, been proposed to be one of the reasons why fertility declined initially in the initial stages of the demographic transition. So as populations industrialized, this affected mobility patterns, family networks tend to break down, people moved further away from their families to find work. So this lack of support for childbearing has been implicated in the initial stages of the fertility transition, but it may still be important today in determining fertility trends. So Thomas has shown that many countries, high-income countries, now have very low fertility. And this may be linked to a lack of support for women to specifically combine work and motherhood, which is what women have been evolved to do all of our history. One way we've been looking at this in my research group recently is my PhD student Alice Raybould has been looking at the association between support from partners and fertility. I'm not quite sure what's happened to the graph on this slide, but I will tell you what the results are anyway. Alice has been doing a systematic review recently of associations between women getting support from their partners and fertility, under the hypothesis that women who get more support from their partners are likely to be more likely to go on to have more children. There's a little bit of variation between populations, as always in these studies. However, on the whole, there is a quite consistent relationship between getting more support from husbands or male partners and women having higher fertility rates. In high-income populations, places like the UK, there is this cultural emphasis on the nuclear family, so it may be that in such populations getting support from the male partner really is quite important for fertility. So to conclude, worldwide we see that kin availability is quite often positively correlated with fertility, and there is some evidence that these associations are plausibly driven by cooperation, but there is a lot of variation in these effects. These associations seem to be rather more robust in higher fertility populations. The picture is a bit more complicated in lower fertility populations. What I suspect is explaining those differences between populations is not that women necessarily get no support for childcare in lower fertility, higher income populations, but they're getting support from a wider range of sources than women do in higher fertility populations. So women are putting together a patchwork of support from including formal schooling, childcare, and also family support. ultimately support does matter for fertility then, which means that I would also agree with Thomas in that we may be seeing a baby bust related to COVID. One of the things that has come out very clearly of the COVID situation is just how difficult it is for parents to raise children alone without any kind of support. And I think that is one of the reasons why we may see a baby bust in the near future related to the COVID pandemic. Just let me conclude by thanking the people who contributed to it and the ELC who funded it. Thank you very much.